For people asking, why aren't any legitimate lawyers representing anti-vaxxers in the fight against mandates? That's not true. We have Scott Street here sitting with us today, and he is an incredible lawyer. I've known him since the first day of law school. Back in 2005, we went to Loyola together. We worked on a case together that was basically upheld a $100 million judgment. He's a real deal attorney, and he is one of the top attorneys fighting against vaccine mandates. And I want to know why. Why would he want to do that? And he answers that today. We discuss all the vaccine issues and a little bit of Ukraine, and really a great, informative, entertaining episode. Check it out.
Law flip, objection, your honor. Turn the game upside down. Law flip, objection, your honor. Turn the game upside down.
So obviously, despite Biden's best efforts to stop Russian attacks on Ukraine, Putin was undeterred. On Thursday, he called what he called a special military operation into the Donbas region of eastern Ukraine. And essentially, we're in a full-scale invasion. Who knows what's going to happen? And I don't know, Scott, just jumping straight into it, does Trump or Biden bear responsibility for Putin's actions on this one?
It's hard to say, Benji. I think it's I think on some level everybody in the West, has some blame because this has been forecasted for years, right? I mean, there's no, it's since the late 90s. I mean, one of the ways, Putin came onto the scene specifically, to reassert Russian authority, right?
Yeah.
And his goals all along have been to put back the Soviet Empire, right?
Yeah.
So it seems completely consistent with that, and that's goes back 20 years. So I'd say everybody is in some way responsible. Shouldn't be a surprise.
It seems like the U.S. has, in our people, we have no appetite for any sort of war based on Iraq, Afghanistan. So I think there's no real disagreement amongst the vast majority of the population that, we don't want boots on the ground. We don't want a military operation. The sanctions are basically the consensus way to deal with it. But I also think there's just a interesting political divide where I'm seeing Trump and the Tucker Carlsons of the world, they're literally overtly rooting for an evil empire in Putin over what seemingly is a consensus peaceful country. Do you have any way to explain that?
It's tough for me to explain anything that Trump does, right? I mean, it's because it's a head that I'm not sure anybody is wants to be inside, really. But they're, I think that politically speaking, right? So politically speaking, what they're seizing on, right, whether it's Trump or whether it's Tucker or whomever, is they're seizing on what Joe Biden, Kamala, others have said in the past about how Trump was a Putin puppet, and Joe was going to come in and look Putin in the eye and beat him back.
Right.
And there are plenty of people who thought all of those comments were fake and that was not going to happen. And what's happening right now is confirming what they said.
Right.
That there's no there's nothing behind the statements and the threats, and so politically they see an advantage in saying that.
I see that. I mean, I that's a fair point. I think the just what I can't understand is I heard a clip of Tucker last night, and I hear Trump literally calling him a genius and praising him and saying this is a good move. I don't remember when Republicans were openly. I just don't see how we got to the point where they're openly rooting for Putin. It's just crazy to me.
Yeah, I mean it's part of the politicized atmosphere, right? I mean it's you have a things are so toxic in this country right now with everything. I mean we'll talk, I'm sure, about other aspects of division, that it's now that's what has led to this, right? I mean, no, it should never be. I mean, it should never be acceptable for a country to invade another country's sovereignty, right? Especially when that country is part of an alliance that's been, that we've pledged our
Yeah.
help to, right? But that's like where we are.
Speaking of
Yeah.
politics, you have a deep history in politics. First of all, we met each other first day of law school, Loyola, 2005, so about 16 years ago. That is crazy.
Yeah.
When I met you, super smart and I wouldn't say liberal, but you definitely had like a history of like affiliation with the Democratic Party, different candidates all the way. And then just as a professional, I've always known you to be super professional, top-notch attorney. You worked on a case with a firm that I worked for, my dad's firm, and pretty much probably like the most noteworthy case either of us have ever been affiliated with, where we upheld a $100 million verdict. So this is, you're a serious lawyer, serious person. And just recently, I saw some headlines, firefighters and all sorts of people litigating the vaccine mandate issue. And I was like, well, there's no way that like a legitimate top-notch attorney is going to be involved in this, because like I just viewed it as, putting aside our feelings on vaccines or masks, I viewed it as like a non-starter. Like these litigation cases are going to go nowhere because these are not real, so a real lawyer is not going to be involved. I look past the headlines and I see you are the lawyer behind these cases. So my first question is, I was going to go straight into this article about, basically that LA is free to fire unvaxxed firefighters. And my friend Jason was speaking out about this issue. Tons of people were pissed off that these hardworking firefighters are basically getting fired over not wanting to get vaxxed. But you taking on this issue, you could choose any field, any practice area. You are like one of the better attorneys that came out of our law school. Why did you choose to focus on this one, the anti-vax litigation, or the vaccine mandate litigation?
It's a complicated question, Benji. So I'll tell you how it happened. I mean, it dates back really to probably the earliest days of the pandemic. I mean, I remember the first time I heard about, the pandemic, and, lockdown orders and so forth. Right. And I started digging into these issues and, found actually, some reports, a lot of research and writing done about pandemics, right. And about how governments have responded to pandemics in the past, and where things were headed, right?
Yeah.
And so I said, there's some interesting stuff. And if you ever read what I wrote for the Federalist website, and I wrote it for the Federalist quite simply because they were the only ones publishing any of this stuff early in the pandemic. I actually found a lot of research from groups like the ACLU, Yale Law School groups, Johns Hopkins School of Public Health. I mean, these are left of center institutions talking about how governments abuse pandemics and states of emergency to trample on civil rights, right? And so, in fact, the judge we have in our case, for the moment at least, in the LA firefighters case, wrote a whole book about this.
Who is it? It's
Michael Linfield.
Michael Linfield took you to task too. I saw an article where I think maybe in one of the complaints you wrote, you said, "Hey, this is these mandates are if not the one of the worst abuses of liberty in our country's history." And he said, "Hey, we're talking about a country that's had slavery and the abuses towards Indians." And he seems to be taking this like almost personal.
Well, yeah, I mean this is why we have a pending request for him to be disqualified for cause. That is, we'll see how that's get ruled.
Am I wrong?
Is
Linfield the judge that recites that does this day in history before every single case? Okay,
yep.
For every single day in court. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, I'm sorry, I cut you off. You were going to
say.
So
no, he you are right about that. But just to correct it, we didn't say they're the worst restrictions or they're worse. We didn't compare them to anything. We said they're the greatest restrictions on liberty in American history, a reference to the to the scope of restrictions, right? The number. This is not discrete discrimination against racial, or it's not discrimination against discrete racial groups. It's you have orders that are affecting
You're saying
millions
the volume,
of people.
The volume.
Right.
Okay.
Correct. So that was the comment, but that's
Obviously
that's
you're
another
not like
issue.
you're not intending to compare this to slavery or to the Holocaust like some others have or anything like that.
No. Yeah, no. This has its place in history.
Is that tough for you because you're a balanced person? I've talked to you over the years. What I've noticed is though you and this could be just mainstream media, this could be what comes into my timeline, so to speak, but people like RFK, who I know that you went on his podcast, RFK Jr. and others, they seem to be doing a little bit of the hyperbole where they're comparing the restrictions to the Holocaust. They're comparing stuff to slavery. I'm not saying you have, but it seems like someone like you, is it frustrating to be lumped in sometimes with a group that's doing that type of stuff?
Not really, because I think you have to take. Well, first of all, I think what people say, people use hyperbole. Hyperbole is a rhetorical device, right? And so sometimes people use hyperbole incorrectly or accidentally or so forth. Some people do so intentionally,
Right.
And so I think you have to assess anything anybody says. First of all, I think you have to look at it in context.
Yeah.
And I think you actually have to listen to it yourself and not just listen to what people say someone said, right?
Yep.
And this is interesting because this came to light for me back in the early days of the pandemic, going back to how I sort of got involved in some of this stuff. I was reading. I became very interested in this narrative that developed early in the pandemic that this is the worst pandemic in 100 years, and there were these comparisons drawn. Well, if 2% of people die, then or 1.5%, if you have a fatality rate of 1.5%, well, the 1918 flu was 10%, and so that's comparable. And you had all these comparisons drawn. You had predictions made based on the comparison of these numbers, which I thought was interesting because I thought, back in 1918, I don't think governments were tracking these numbers very well, right? So I started digging into the alleged case fatality rate from the 1918 flu, and basically, making a long story short, found out that number is effectively made up. I mean, it's basically the only original source for that number comes from some journal article that was written in the 1960s, which no one really knows how they came up with it. And then it's just been, but the New York Times picked up on it. And so you got to a point now where it's been so many people use that number that every time it got used, people, the next reporter would say, they just look at the New York Times and assume, well, the New York Times must be correct.
Yeah.
So we just keep, and it's now been established, even though no one knows what it's based on. And when you dig down deeper, you realize that it could be, it could be wrong. And so for me as a lawyer, you're right. I am a registered Democrat, work for a lot of Democratic politicians and elected officials. But, I am first and foremost a lawyer. And one of the things I like about the law is the law teaches you that if you do enough research, if you read, if you study, if you go through and put the work in, you will figure out really what the answer should be. And yes, there can be arguments on both sides, but you don't have to take someone else's word for it because the sources are all right there. And that's what I always do. And when I started doing that back in the early stages of the pandemic, it led me, that research analysis led me to a place that was completely the polar opposite of what people who I'm politically aligned with normally were saying.
Interesting.
And what that was surprising to me, but it actually convinced me that I was right, and it convinced me that I needed to do something about it, because I figured, if I'm not going to having done all that work, if I just let this sort of sit to the side and ignore it, that's there's the people who are going to do the work aren't as good as me. They're not going to understand the issues as well as me. And I'm doing a disservice, not just all these people who are affected by it, whether it's firefighters or whomever, but doing a disservice to myself.
So you're a true believer. It sounds like this is not just because a lot of times we as lawyers you'll say, hey, I don't align with this guy politically. I don't align with how he operates, but he deserves representation, right? That's a foundational legal principle, is that everybody has a right to an attorney. You don't have to take on people as clients, but it sounds like you actually are a true believer. You talked about data, right? And so I just saw an article where New York Times article, according to CDC, or according to New York Times, the CDC isn't publishing large portions of the data it collects. So that's a catchy headline. That's like, okay, what are they hiding? But I think what I have a hard time with the position of, the sort of, for lack of better words, anti-vaxxer position, or is there a term that, they prefer, or you prefer to when you talk about, or is it freedom, medical freedom, or what is it?
I mean, I don't care what term people use. I mean, it's. I mean, I would say if you're referring to someone, I always prefer to be specific in who I refer to, because there's lumping people into a group is
dangerous.
always dangerous. I mean, look, there are people who are against all vaccines.
Yeah.
I wouldn't put Bobby Kennedy into that group. I wouldn't put most of the people who I deal with
Let's go through that.
Into that group.
Do you believe is there a distinction between the COVID vaccine and the rest of vaccines?
In what sense?
In the sense in the legal context, and why, let's say in the school context, there's no great you're not taking on fights right now for all the other vaccines being mandated in the schools, right?
Yeah. So what they are, I mean, I'll tell you my analysis of this. Okay, is my analysis of this is that all vaccines are medical treatments.
Yep.
Okay, and then that's undisputed. The question then becomes, from a legal matter, is do you have a right to object to this medical treatment?
Right.
And where I see this, and to me it's actually very, very, very clear, is that in California, which has a state right, constitutional right to privacy, express right, that was adopted back in 1972, a competent adult has the right to refuse medical treatment.
Right, but not,
Okay.
but the mandates have been held up by the Supreme Court, and there's no. Are you taking the position that in all the schools and all the employers that require vaccines of every other kind, is there something distinct about this vaccine that says, hey, yeah, I get the other vaccines, you're requiring those for schools and requiring those for employment, but this one is different? Or are you saying all of them have the issue?
No, so it's. I mean, look. It's pretty simple. Until recently, right? So until 2021, really, the only in the state of California, which is where I'm focused, because I haven't looked at the law everywhere, right?
Mm-hmm.
Federal law is a little bit different. In the state of California, the only vaccine mandates that have been upheld as lawful, to my knowledge, and no one's ever shown me otherwise, are immunization requirements for school children. Okay, those date back to a case called Abeel, ABEL, which was decided in 1890. Then there were cases, two prominent cases in 2000 and 2018. But school children aren't competent adults.
Right.
That's the difference. Okay, so school children, and this is actually the case in all kinds of circumstances. School children, especially in public schools in this state, don't have the same constitutional rights that adults have. That's the difference.
And are you okay? You're okay with that? You're not like disputing that should be the case?
No, I think it's. I think that the standard. I'm not saying school children have no rights, constitutional rights. That's been an area that's been increasingly litigated over the last 25 years, both the state and the federal level. But what I'm saying is for purposes of all these cases that we're dealing with.
Yeah.
When the government or an employer, someone. And by the way, the state, unlike federal law, the state California constitutional right to privacy applies both against the government and against private parties.
But what I guess
So
what I'm
that's-
not
that's the
understanding,
difference.
help me understand, because what I'm not seeing is, from a legal perspective, what's the distinction between all the vaccines that are required in the schools versus this one? And let's just start with that one for schools. What is the distinction between all the vaccine requirements versus the COVID vaccine requirement?
Well, there's no COVID vaccine requirement for schools right now. It's been
Well, it's
issued by the
coming. No,
legislature.
there's-
They're trying to do it.
No, at certain ages, there's a requirement at certain ages. At Ariane, I thought for some no.
Not from the not
No.
not from the state. They would like to have it, and certain people are
Certain counties are at least
trying to
imposing.
do it, but
Yeah.
it's being fought over, and there's a issue being litigated about whether individual school districts have the authority to require that. A court in San Diego said they don't,
I saw that,
because it can only be done at the state level.
Okay.
So the state is.
Okay, but just from your legal perspective, right now, without, I mean, maybe you haven't researched the specific issue, but is there a distinction between requiring all the vaccines that are required in schools across the board in California versus the vaccine for COVID?
Well, it's the same. It's the same legal analysis. I mean, the question, if you're talking about what's in schools, like for example, okay, if you're talking about in schools where school children don't have the same extent of constitutional rights as competent adults have, then there's the legal standard is going to be more favorable to the government, right? But the question then is going to be, do the COVID vaccines accomplish what the government says that they accomplish? Okay, because if you look at the cases that were decided regarding these immunization requirements that were adopted during the 60s, right? These those vaccine requirements were it's actually in the legislative record. Very, very detailed findings. Multiple clinical trials that showed that they were effective, they were safe, so forth, right? That hasn't been done for the COVID vaccine. I mean, no one could even argue with a straight face that that's been done for the COVID vaccine. So that's going to be an area where, as a legal matter, so long as you have judges who are applying the law faithfully, that's going to be an issue that's fought about. Now, how does that turn out? I don't know, because a lot of that evidence hasn't been gathered.
Yeah.
But it is a distinction, and the problem has been, quite frankly, the issue I have with the way these cases have been litigated and decided. One of the reasons why I've been doing them is you get people making arguments that are far too broad on both sides.
Yeah.
They're never allowed, or they're always allowed.
Right.
And
There's no nuance.
There's no nuance. And the truth is, and you being a good lawyer and diligent lawyer will know this, is the truth is usually somewhere in between.
Yep.
And it's got to be litigated.
Yeah.
And so all I've tried to do in my cases is to say, look, I don't believe I'm not going to take either side. I'm not going to take the side that says these are always unlawful and they're horrible and they're poison all the time. I'm also not going to take the side that says, oh yeah, of course these are always legal and you have no rights and you can't, you go homeschool your kids if you don't care about it, or don't work, you don't
Is
need
it
a
more
job.
of it for you?
Somewhere in
is
between,
it,
and it's got to be fought
Is
about.
it a person? But is the vaccine? Do you have personal vaccine skepticism, or is this more of a legal liberty, my body, my choice type of thing for you?
It's not. I mean, so look, am I generally skeptical of vaccines? No. Do I? I don't personally fall into the camp of people who think, who I would say, like, the Jenny McCarthy's of the world, who think all vaccines cause autism. They may not. I don't know. That's not my issue.
Have you seen? Like, I think that's actually a really important line for someone, because people are looking at you. You're a legitimate lawyer. You're fighting these issues. Some of the foundational issues is like, do you believe in COVID? Do you believe that vaccines are generally safe and effective? Or what information are you relying on to make you think that those things are not true?
So, I mean, if you're asking me those questions, yeah, of course, everyone. I mean, COVID is a real virus. It cannot be eliminated, right? It's going to become like it's becoming endemic if it's not already, right? Like most respiratory viruses, it affects the elderly and people
Right.
who are um, not healthy
Right.
worse. I mean, that's been known from day one, right?
Yep.
Is it as to the vaccines? I mean, look, it's. I personally chose not to get the COVID vaccine.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and I had and I had COVID like in the winter, like everyone else on the planet did, and it had virtually no effect on me. You know, my wife, who was required to get the COVID shots for her work, also had it, was the one who gave it to everyone else in the
She
house.
had the vaccine and she had.
Yeah, and she had it the worst. It did
Yeah.
not, literally did nothing for her.
Yeah.
So
But it's not an apples to I like the that's the whole thing with just like we never know how COVID's gonna affect people. We don't know how the vaccine's gonna affect people. But it seems like, and you're a data guy, right? You just like, and I've talked about this. I had what appears to be a COVID vaccine side effect, but I still believe, all things considered, if you just look at like, if you believe that there have been close to 1 million COVID deaths, and I'm not aware of anything, I'm not aware of any COVID vaccine deaths. I know there's been what's the that thing that people report, the database that people,
VAERS.
the VAERS report, but I'm not aware. So just like from a numbers thing, like if you're rolling the dice, you're a parent and you don't want to tell your kid that you knew that vaccines were available and you know you're gonna die. I'm gonna say like, okay, like it makes sense to get the vaccine, and it makes sense that the government is trying to do everything possible to save the country. And this isn't just a US thing, this is a global thing. So I think this is where it's tough. It's like, what would you propose the government do instead of this? Is there a balanced way? Because my feeling is that, and this is where it's a hard time, because right now I feel like there's no point, like none of this stuff makes sense anymore, because it's like half pregnant. You have basically all these regulations. It's like gun control. You can't have like some people are wearing masks, some people aren't, some people are vaccinated, some people aren't. But is there a balance? Because it feels like to me we should have been more like stringent from the beginning, but because we aren't, we should just let everybody just do what they need to do at this point.
Well, I think the answer is, you let people do what they want to do. I mean, that's what our country. I mean, I would say that's what our country requires. And you give people, you give people the information that they need. You give them as much information as they need and want.
Mm-hmm.
You don't hide information. You don't withhold information. And you and you find, I mean, this is, it's public health. It's interesting. I've been working with a lot of, doctors and epidemiologists, public health experts, and they all say that, the idea of public health is not about just avoiding disease. It encompasses a lot of other factors, including, personal choice.
Yep.
Right. And so it's, and I think that's as important as, as anything. I mean, I also represented a number of a statewide coalition of gym owners who fought the closure of gyms last year in the early stages of the pandemic, right? And they all felt very, very strongly that, exercising, working out is a critical component of individual health. So how it makes sense to cut people off from that is, it just doesn't make sense to me. That to me cannot be a public health solution to close places that people need to stay healthy, stay fit, stay healthy. So that's, and by the way, I mean, those are my personal views, and I think they're not just my personal views, but I think they're also required by law in this country. But if you go back, and one of the reasons I feel quite secure, notwithstanding all of the noise in the background, I feel quite secure in those beliefs, is if you go back to, there was something that a report that the ACLU published in 2000, I think it was 2008 or 2009, criticized all of these pandemic response plans. You got to understand, these pandemic response plans, they didn't exist before 9/11. Okay,
Yeah.
so what happened after 9/11 was the Bush White House came around and basically told people, you're not prepared for a terrorist attack. You're not prepared for these horrible things, whether it's because a lot of people thought that, hey, if you're a terrorist and you want to, really do damage to the United States or any Western country, just plant a virus,
Right.
right? I mean, there's movies made about this. Okay, it was widely discussed, and so you had all these pandemic response plans that were developed in the mid 2000s, and the ACLU just went off on these plans in 2008, 2009, and said they were they basically they represented a national security approach that was flawed. Okay, the ACLU said compulsory vaccination doesn't work and is totally antithetical to American values. They talked about, you should actually read it. It was the first piece I wrote for the Federalist, and I published it at the Federalist because no one else would publish it. And actually, when I read the ACLU report from 2008, I almost fell out of my chair when I read it, because it's exactly what's happening right now.
That's
And
crazy.
in 2008, the ACLU was saying, we can't have this. This doesn't work. It's counterproductive.
Could you
And
send us
now-
the links? We'll include it in our email. We'll include the links to those articles.
Yeah, I'll
that
send it to you. And now they're saying, oh, it's fine. And to me, that's, I, as somebody who is, has deep reverence for the law, and I really don't like hypocrisy,
Yeah.
and it's one of my biggest pet peeves. And when I saw that, I just realized that there's something else going on, because if you're a group like the ACLU, you want to be consistent with what you have said all along.
Sure.
You take the same position, even if there's a political downside to it. They didn't do that, and so that showed me that this was a political issue. I mean, you got to ask yourself this question. I've asked many of my friends this question: what would be happening in this country right now if Donald Trump said, "I'm going to fire all federal employees who don't have the COVID vaccine, whether they like it or not"?
I don't think there would be. I think it would. There. This is my genuine answer. I think it would be pretty united.
Oh, see, I don't
I think.
so.
I think he has politicized the issue so much that there's a great. I think that there was never that prior to Donald Trump, there was a pretty large consensus of like vaccine mandates are basically part of the deal, and I never heard. Jenny McCarthy was the person that was the voice, and RFK Jr. was the voice, and people kind of looked at that as like the quacks. I'm not no disrespect intended, but that's what I thought of it as. And I think post Donald Trump, it's basically like he turned a ton of people into vaccine skeptics. That's my personal opinion, but who knows?
I mean, I don't know. I mean, it's interesting. It's an interesting question. I mean, I remember what Dems like Gavin Newsom and so forth were saying about the Trump vaccines early on.
I think like
It's an interesting.
no, you're right. First of all,
it's-
I'm not. This is an equal across the board thing. Democrats, Republicans are hypocritical. Newsom, Garcetti, sickening. Like some of the stuff they've done in the past several weeks and months and years. But I just think that he has politicized it more than anybody and has been a big cause of the divide. But anyway, we got to go to legal tip. Listen, first of all, thank you, Scott, for coming. I'm going to have you do an outro, but it's been really helpful. I'd love to have you come back and talk more about these issues. We're going to move to legal tip.
This is the legal tip of the moment, sponsored by the Ball Crushers at Benowitz Law Corporation. Keep copies of your work documents. Things like employee handbooks, pay stubs, policy memos, and other documents from your employment may wind up proving extremely helpful if you ever have a legal claim against your employer. I know when you're working at a job, you don't always think ahead to the possibility of suing your employer, but you never know what may happen in the future, and it's best to be prepared because your employer has legal counsel and undoubtedly uses it.
My name is Benji Smith of Smith Law. We got an employment, personal injury, and class action law firm. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about was Gwen Stefani once said, "Don't speak." Part of a No Doubt song from like 25 years ago. what I want to tell is employees, you need to not communicate with anybody other than your lawyer or your trusted medical professionals or therapist when it comes to your case, because everything you say can and will be used against you. We say this and not all the employees listen, but it comes back to bite them sometimes. So my advice is, please talk to me, talk to your lawyer before you talk to anybody else, before you write text messages to your employees or colleagues, your old colleagues. Do not speak unless your attorney says speak. So, Scott, thank you so much for coming on. We really appreciate it. Any parting words, and tell us where we could find you.
Well, so you can find me now at the law offices of J.W. Howard Attorneys. Just opened an office in L.A., so you can follow me. We're getting back up on social media soon. But otherwise, you can find all my writings on the Federalist website, which I'll send to you.
Awesome.
And,
okay.
My feeling is, don't. I say the same thing to everyone. Don't trust what anybody tells you. Go read it for yourself. Or in the words of Ronald Reagan, trust, but if you do trust but verify.
Love it. Okay, Scott, seriously, thank you so much. It's so good to see you. We will see you next time, Law Flip.
Law flip, objection, Your Honor. Turn the game upside down. Law flip, objection, Your Honor. Turn the game upside down. Connect with us on Instagram. We're at LawFlip. LawFlip is produced by Blue Crescent Media. You can learn more about BCM at bluecrescentmedia.com. Our intro music is provided by Penn Practice, and our Law Flip identity was created by Garrett Whiston and Travis Nagel. And lastly, this podcast is made available by Smith & Benowitz for educational and entertainment purposes only. By listening to this podcast, you understand that no attorney-client relationship is being formed between you and Smith & Benowitz or any of its attorneys. This podcast should not be used as a substitute for competent legal advice from a licensed professional attorney in your state. To the extent this podcast may be considered an advertisement, Benjamin Smith is the attorney responsible for this advertisement. Thank you.